welcome. Wherever you are listening from tonight, let the day fall away gently. Let the room stay dim. Let your body sink into stillness. There is nothing you need to hold on to, nothing you need to solve, and nothing you need to stay awake for. This story will unfold slowly, and you are allowed to drift off at any point. Tonight's story begins in a quiet place. A summer camp surrounded by trees, cabins resting in darkness, and the kind of silence people trust without thinking. This is the story of the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders. In the summer of 1977, a group of young girls arrived at Camp Scott in Oklahoma for what was meant to be a normal week of camp life. There were songs, activities, laughter, and the steady routine of an organized place meant for safety. The adults watched over the campers. The cabins were assigned, the lights went out on time, and then, by morning, everything changed. What followed was not only a heartbreaking crime, but a long and complex investigation that would stretch through years of suspicion. Courtroom proceedings, public debate, and questions that never fully settled. It became a case that remained heavy in memory, not because of its noise, but because of its contrast. A place made for innocence, a night that should have been uneventful, a silence that was broken without warning. This story is told carefully and calmly. There is no music, no sudden sounds, no interruptions. You do not need to follow every detail. You do not need to remember every name. Let the narration move like distant thought, something you can listen to closely if you want to, or something you can allow to fade behind your breathing as sleep arrives. If your mind wanders, let it wander. If your eyelids grow heavy, let them close. The story will continue whether you are awake or asleep. You are safe where you are. The night is quiet, and we can begin. In the 1970s, Oklahoma carried a quiet rhythm that felt steady and familiar to the people who lived there. Life moved at a slower pace than it did in larger cities on the coasts, shaped by small towns, open roads, and communities where families often knew one another across generations. There was a sense of distance from the wider world's noise, as if the state existed slightly apart from national unrest, held together by routine, church gatherings, school calendars, and the ordinary pace of work and home. The decade itself was marked by change in the United States, but in many parts of Oklahoma, that change arrived softly. People heard about rising crime in distant places, but it still felt far away, like something that belonged to bigger cities and unfamiliar streets. Many families believed that danger was something you could avoid by choosing the right places and raising children in the right environments. Safety was not treated as something fragile. It was treated as something natural. Summer, in particular, was a season of tradition. Children finished school, and the days opened up into long stretches of heat and freedom. Families planned small trips, attended local fairs, and sent kids to camps that had existed for years without incident. Summer camp was seen as a wholesome rite of passage. It was a place where children learned independence in small doses, away from home but still protected by adult supervision and clear rules. Parents trusted the structure. They trusted the people running it. They trusted the environment. Organizations like the Girl Scouts carried a special kind of confidence in the public imagination. They represented stability and moral clarity. Their programs were built around growth, safety, friendship, and responsibility. Uniforms, badges, handbooks, and rules were all part of the same message: that this was a controlled space where children would be guided and protected. When families sent their daughters to Girl Scout camp, they believed they were sending them into the safest version of the unknown. The culture of camps in that era was also different from how people view such places today. There was less surveillance, less fear of strangers, and far fewer precautions built around worst-case scenarios. Campgrounds were designed for freedom, not confinement. Cabins were simple. Trails were open. The wilderness itself was treated as the primary challenge, something to be respected but not feared as a human threat. The danger, in most minds, came from storms, injuries, or getting lost for a short time before an adult found you. It did not come from violence arriving in the night. Oklahoma's landscape reinforced that sense of calm. The state held wide rural spaces where quiet felt natural, not suspicious. Thick tree lines, creeks, and open fields created an atmosphere that could feel protective, as though nature itself formed a barrier between the camp and the rest of the world. In the daytime, the outdoors felt bright and welcoming. At night, it became darker, deeper, and more silent, but still familiar to those who grew up around it. At the same time, the decade brought a kind of invisibility that shaped many crimes across the country. People traveled more than before. Roads were easier. Movement between states was ordinary. Individuals could pass through towns unnoticed, and the structure to track them was limited. Communication between agencies was slower. Databases were not shared in the way they are now. A person who wanted to remain unseen could do so more easily than people realized. Yet for most families in Oklahoma, these realities existed only in the background. Day-to-day life did not feel threatened. Parents still sent children to friends' houses without calling ahead. Neighborhoods still felt like shared spaces. Doors were still sometimes left unlocked. The world felt understandable, and people believed they could sense danger when it was near. This was the emotional atmosphere surrounding that summer. A sense of confidence built on routine. A belief that the world was mostly predictable if you stayed within familiar boundaries. A trust that places designed for children, especially places tied to respected organizations, would remain protected by their purpose alone. It is important to remember this, because it explains why the events that followed struck with such force. It was not only that something terrible happened, it was where it happened. It was the idea that a place dedicated to childhood, learning, and safety could become the setting for fear. In 1977, Oklahoma was not expecting a story like this to unfold inside its forests. Camp Scott was meant to be part of the season's normal rhythm, a week of ordinary excitement and small adventures. It was supposed to be a safe pause from home, not a place that would become remembered through grief. And that is what makes the case so enduring. The contrast between the decade's sense of security and what actually occurred. The way that one night broke through a cultural assumption, leaving behind the understanding that safety is not always guaranteed by intention, and that quiet places can still hold unseen threats. In the next part of this story, we move closer to that place, not as an abstract setting, but as a real camp with cabins, trails, and routines. Camp Scott was the kind of place people described with warmth before they ever described it with fear. Hidden among trees in northeastern Oklahoma, it was designed to feel like a retreat from ordinary life, a place where girls could spend a week learning, small independence, while still being surrounded by structure and supervision. For the Girl Scouts, the camp was meant to represent safety, growth, and tradition. For families, it represented something even simpler, a place where daughters could be children in the most innocent way. The camp itself sat within a rural landscape where the woods felt quiet and enduring. The air carried the scent of summer heat and soil, with the occasional softness of distant water and wind through leaves. During the day, the trees filtered the sunlight into patches of gold and shadow. The paths were familiar to staff and returning campers, leading from cabins to gathering areas and activity spaces, with the kind of casual order camps often rely on. Nothing at Camp Scott was meant to feel like a boundary. It was meant to feel open. Cabins were arranged in clusters that balanced community with separation. Each cabin area had its own identity, often given names that made them feel like part of a story, rather than part of a property map. There were shared spaces for campfire gatherings, places for meals, and simple structures where campers would learn and play. At night, These areas changed in character. Daylight made everything friendly and visible. Darkness made everything quiet and private. The routines of camp life were built on predictability. Wake-up times, breakfast, morning activities, structured games, lunch, more programs, dinner, evening gatherings, then lights out. These routines existed not only to keep children busy, but to keep them safe. Predictability is a kind of protection. When everyone knows what is supposed to happen next, it becomes easier to notice when something is wrong. Like many camps in the 1970s, Camp Scott did not operate with the kind of security people would expect today. There were no cameras, no locked gates controlling every entrance and exit. The boundaries were natural rather than enforced. Woods and distance created separation from the outside world, and for many, that separation felt like the same thing as protection. But nature does not function like a locked door. The same trees that made the camp feel secluded also made it difficult to see beyond a short distance. Paths disappeared into shade quickly. Small sounds could travel far, yet also become unrecognizable, blending into the normal noises of wildlife and wind. At night, the forest did not feel dangerous in the way people imagine danger now. It felt simply dark, a deep quiet that most campers had never experienced so fully before. The staff at Camp Scott were responsible for maintaining order across this large outdoor space. Counselors were assigned to groups. They guided campers from activity to activity, taught rules, and created the sense that the camp was organized and under control. Adults were present. Adults were watching. The system was built on trust that supervision and routine were enough. For most campers, the most unsettling part of the camp at night was not the thought of another person. It was the unfamiliarity of the darkness itself. Shadows between cabins, the sound of insects, the way the woods could make even small distances feel longer. Children whispered about ghost stories, not because they believed them, but because it was part of camp culture. A controlled form of fear that always ended in laughter and the return of safety. What makes the setting important is how normal it appeared in the daytime. Camp Scott was not abandoned. It was not remote wilderness in the extreme sense. It was a working camp, organized and structured, filled with children and counselors and schedules. It was active, busy, and full of ordinary life. That normality was part of its identity. The camp was also built on the assumption of goodness. Girl Scout culture was rooted in values of kindness, responsibility, and community. The camp environment reflected that. Rules were not designed to protect against extreme threats. They were designed to teach cooperation, independence, and confidence. It was a space formed around the belief that children should be allowed to experience the world without constant fear. When the camp filled with girls arriving for summer session, it became lively quickly. Laughter traveled through the trees. Counselors called out instructions. Bags were carried and unpacked. Friendships formed almost instantly. Camp has a way of making time feel different. The world outside fades. The days become their own small universe, defined by meals, games, and the warm exhaustion that comes from constant activity. And then night arrives. Lights in cabins dim. Flashlights click on and off. Voices soften. The last conversation of the day becomes murmurs and giggles beneath blankets. Counselors make sure everyone settles. Rules about staying in the cabin are repeated gently but firmly. In many camps, the first night has its own energy, a mixture of excitement and homesickness, both of which feel stronger in the dark. Camp Scott was meant to be a safe place for that first night feeling. A place where children could fall asleep in a cabin, surrounded by peers, knowing an adult was nearby, knowing morning would come with breakfast and activity and laughter again. This was what parents imagined when they signed permission slips and waved goodbye. The camp's design supported that belief. Cabins were separated enough for privacy, but close enough to feel connected. paths linked everything together. Staff moved around and checked on groups. It felt controlled in the way a summer camp always feels controlled. Not through force, but through routine. But what makes Camp Scott significant in this story is the way that the same openness that allowed for freedom also allowed for vulnerability. The woods were not a wall. The darkness was not a lock. The camp's boundaries were invisible in the night, and what could move through them was not limited to what people expected. When people later tried to understand what happened there, they returned again and again to the setting. Not because the camp caused the violence, but because the camp made the violence harder to comprehend. It was supposed to be a place of safety, so complete that danger felt impossible. It was a place built to host children, to create trust, to allow sleep. And that is why the story begins here, in the calm structure of Camp Scott. A place designed for ordinary summer nights. A place that seemed quiet and secure as the lights went out. A place where the woods held only the sound of insects, the soft movement of leaves, and children slowly drifting to sleep. The first day at camp, Scott began the way most first days at camp begin, with movement and excitement that felt almost like energy had been poured into the trees themselves. Cars arrived in small waves, dust lifting from the road as families pulled in and parked. Parents stepped out with bags, sleeping gear, and the kind of careful cheer adults use when they want to make goodbyes feel easy. For many girls, it was the first time spending nights away from home without family nearby, and the feeling was a mixture of pride and nervousness that sat quietly beneath the smiles. Counselors greeted the campers with practiced warmth. Names were checked, groups were organized, and each girl was guided toward where to place belongings. The camp had a system, and that system was meant to make everything feel stable. When children feel unsure, structure becomes comfort. When they see adults who appear confident, they begin to believe they are safe. The air that day carried the familiar warmth of an Oklahoma summer. It was not the kind of heat that felt harsh, but the kind that made everything smell alive. Grass, trees, sun-baked wood, and the faint scent of earth in shaded places. The camp felt like its own contained world, separate from towns and homes. A place where the rules were different in the best way. Cabins became small centers of new life. Girls carried bags inside, chose bunks, and began the quiet process of making a temporary home feel personal. Blankets were spread. Flashlights were tucked away. Small items from home were placed on shelves as if they could anchor comfort. Conversations started quickly. A simple question, like where someone was from, could turn into laughter within minutes. Summer camp has a way of compressing social distance. Everyone is new, so everyone is allowed to become familiar fast. For some, the first day was filled with excitement. For others, it held a thin thread of homesickness that came and went like a tide. A child might laugh loudly and then fall silent for a moment, remembering home, before being pulled back into the noise of new activity. Counselors were trained to notice this and respond gently, not with pressure, but with distraction and reassurance. It was normal. First days always carried that emotional weather. Activities began soon after arrival. Campers were introduced to the routines that would shape the week, where meals were held, where group gatherings took place. The boundaries of the camp, not as fences, but as understood spaces. The paths that connected everything. The rules about staying with groups and listening to counselors. None of this felt strict. It felt like orientation, a soft introduction into a world where children could explore without getting lost. Meals were another moment of grounding. Eating together in a camp setting creates a sense of belonging quickly. It reminds everyone that they are part of a group now, that they will be cared for in practical ways, that the day has a rhythm. Girls sat beside new friends and talked with the intensity children have when everything is new. They compared lunches at home, siblings, schools, favorite games. It was ordinary conversation, and that ordinariness was part of the comfort. As the afternoon went on, the camp grew louder with life. Girls ran between activity areas, their voices rising in excitement, then fading as they moved deeper into trees or behind buildings. Counselors moved with them, keeping order without making it feel like supervision. The camp's energy made it easy to believe the week would unfold exactly as planned. Evening arrived gradually, and with it came a softer mood. The heat of the day eased. Shadows lengthened across paths. The light became golden and then dimmer, and the woods began to feel deeper. At many camps, this is when the first day begins to shift from outward excitement to inward quiet. The novelty is still present, but exhaustion starts to settle in. The body begins to notice how much it has been moving. As darkness approached, routines continued. Dinner, cleanup, maybe a group gathering or campfire activity, depending on the schedule. These moments were designed to create a sense of unity, to settle everyone into the idea that the camp was not just a place, but a shared experience. Songs might have been sung, stories told, and rules repeated gently, the way they often are at camp, so they do not feel heavy. The first night is always different from the nights that follow. It holds a special kind of tension, not in a frightening way, but in a psychological way. Children are adjusting to unfamiliar beds and unfamiliar sounds. The woods around the cabins make noises they have never heard from inside a home. Insects hum, leaves shift. The distance between cabins feels larger once the sun is gone. Counselors understood this, and they moved through cabin areas, making sure everyone felt calm. They reminded campers to stay inside, to use the buddy system if they needed to go anywhere, and to settle down once lights out began. These instructions were normal, not alarming. They were the same kind of instructions given every year. Inside the cabins, the mood became quieter. Girls talked in low voices. Some giggled, unable to fully stop the excitement. Others lay still, staring into darkness, listening to the small sounds outside. Flashlights flickered briefly, then disappeared. The cabin became its own small world of breathing, shifting blankets, and whispered words that faded as sleep arrived. For most of the camp, that first night was simply a first night. A normal, sleepy transition into the rhythm of a week away from home. The kind of night that would usually be remembered only as a warm blur, the beginning of new friendships and camp memories. But in the story of Camp Scott, the first day becomes something else. It becomes the last day of normality. It becomes the final stretch of sunlight before the camp changed forever. Not because anyone sensed it coming, but because the tragedy that followed would reach back through every ordinary moment and turn it into something heavy. The laughter on the paths, the bags on the bunks, the routines that felt safe, all of it would later be remembered with the ache of hindsight. And as the camp settled into darkness that night, it did so with the same simple belief held by every child and every counselor there. That morning would come, and everything would continue exactly as planned. Before the case became defined by investigation, courtrooms, and long years of questions. It began with 3 young girls arriving at camp the way children have arrived at summer camps for generations. They came with bags packed by family members, with excitement that felt too big for their bodies, and with the quiet nervousness that always hides behind a brave smile. They were not symbols, they were not headlines. They were simply children stepping into what should have been a normal week. Their names were Laurie Farmer, Doris Milner, and Michelle Guzet. They were all 10 years old. In the structure of a camp, 10 is an age balance between childhood and early independence. It is old enough to feel confident walking to activities with friends, but young enough to still feel comforted by routine and familiar voices. It is an age where friendships form quickly and intensely, and where a new environment can feel magical in the daylight and unsettling only for a moment after dark. They were at the age where camp is supposed to become a memory that lasts forever in the best way. Laurie Farmer was described by those who knew her as bright and full of life. Like many children, she carried her own mix of confidence and sensitivity, a personality shaped by family, school, and the world she had already begun to observe. At camp, she would have been one of the many girls taking in everything at once. The cabins, the activities, the other campers, the little rituals that make camp feel like its own universe. She was not arriving with fear. She was arriving with expectation. Doris Milner, known to many as Dory, came from a large family and was described as cheerful and kind. Children from big families often grow up with a particular kind of social ease, accustomed to noise and shared space, familiar with the rhythms of siblings and household routines. That kind of background can make camp feel natural, like an extension of the structured chaos children already know. For someone like Doris, being around other girls, joining activities, and settling into a cabin would have felt like stepping into another family for a week. Michelle Guse was often described as thoughtful and steady. Some children arrive at camp and immediately become the loudest voice in the room. Others arrive with quieter confidence, observing first, speaking later, choosing carefully who to trust and where to belong. Michelle was remembered as a girl who carried herself with a calm presence, the kind of calm that is not distant but grounded. At camp, that sort of presence can be comforting. It can make friendships feel safe. Together, these girls were assigned to the same cabin area. Camp Scott, like many camps, organized cabins by age group, allowing children to spend time with others at the same stage of life. The cabin setting creates an intimacy quickly. Girls sleep near one another, laugh together, whisper at night, and form bonds that can feel surprisingly deep after only a day or two. For campers, the cabin becomes the heart of the experience. It is where they return between activities. It is where they feel most like they belong. On the first day, the girls would have been introduced to the rhythms of the camp. They would have found where meals were served, where counselors gathered groups, and which paths led from cabins to shared spaces. They would have participated in small activities that were meant to build comfort and connection. There may have been games designed to help girls learn each other's names, small tasks that encouraged cooperation, and moments where new friendships started forming with very little effort. This is one of the hardest parts of any true crime story involving children. The contrast between their normality and the tragedy that follows. The way that the day itself was ordinary, filled with routine and small happiness that should have remained untouched. In the retelling of cases like this, it is easy to feel as if the ending was always inevitable. But it was not. At that moment, there was no shadow hanging over their movements. There was only the present. Summer camps are places where children begin to feel brave in small ways. They learn to sleep in a different bed. They learn to walk to activities without a parent nearby. They learn how to share space with others. They learn how to belong to a group. These are ordinary lessons, and they happen in the quiet repetition of camp life. Meals, games, craft sessions, walks through woods, small achievements marked by badges, praise, and laughter. These girls were there for that reason. They were not there because of danger. They were there because of trust. Their families trusted the camp. They trusted the Girl Scouts. They trusted the routines that had existed for years. They trusted that the same system that produced happy memories for thousands of children would do the same for them. At camp, children carry a kind of innocence that is difficult to describe until it is contrasted with fear. They move through the world assuming adults have built safety correctly. They assume cabins are safe because they are cabins. They assume counselors are nearby. They assume the rules exist to protect them from small dangers, not from the unimaginable. That trust is part of childhood. It is not ignorance. It is the natural state of being cared for. And during the first day, everything around them reinforced that trust. Counselors were present. Activities were organized. Food was served. Rules were repeated. Friendships formed. The camp operated exactly as it was designed to operate. Nothing about the environment suggested that the girls should feel unsafe. By the evening, the girls would have begun settling into the quieter rhythm of camp at night. After dinner, perhaps after a gathering or a final activity, they would have returned to their cabin area with the familiar fatigue that comes after a long day outdoors. Shoes would have been kicked off, bags shifted, flashlights placed within reach. The small rituals of bedtime would have begun. Whispers, soft laughter, a few girls staying awake longer than they should. If any fear existed in the cabin, it would likely have been the gentle kind of fear that belongs to camp stories, ghost tales, imaginary creatures, the playful thrill of being in the woods. These are the kinds of fears that are invited. They are meant to be safe. They were not preparing for something real, and that is why it remains so difficult, decades later, to hold the story without feeling the weight of the contrast. A space designed for children, filled with children's voices, becoming quiet in the way all camps become quiet at night. Not because something is wrong, but because everyone is drifting toward sleep. The girls themselves were ordinary in the truest sense. They were not defined by unusual circumstances. They were not connected to a larger mystery. They did not live lives that drew attention. They were children enjoying the start of summer camp, a memory in progress. In any case like this, it is easy for the victims to be flattened into the moment they were taken. But the truth is that their lives extended beyond that night, even if history does not record every detail. They belonged to families who knew their habits, their voices, their moods, their laughter. They belonged to communities that held their names before strangers ever spoke them. They were the reason the camp existed. They were the reason the Girl Scout program mattered. And when the tragedy occurred, it did not just harm 3 families. It broke something larger, something cultural and collective. It broke the assumption that a place made for children is automatically protected by its purpose. For the rest of the story, the case will move into investigation, evidence, and questions that never fully settled. But here, in the center of it, are 3 girls who arrived at camp the same way so many had arrived before them. Excited, tired, curious, and safe in the belief that sleep would come easily and morning would bring another day of camp. This is where the story remains most human. Not in theories, not in suspects, but in the simple truth that these girls were there for summer camp, and nothing about the first day suggested their week would end in tragedy. That night at camp, Scott began with a kind of calm that only exists in places designed for children. The energy of the first day had slowly softened, not because excitement had disappeared, but because tiredness had finally started to win. After hours of movement and new experiences, the campers settled into the evening routine, carried along by the structure that camp always provides. Dinner had come and gone, and the camp's voices gradually quieted. The bright daytime sounds faded into something gentler. Counselors moved between groups, guiding the girls back toward their cabins, reminding everyone to stay close, to listen, to keep track of one another. It was the first night of the session, and the first night always carried its own atmosphere. People were still learning where things were, still adjusting to sleeping away from home, still balancing thrill with uncertainty. As darkness fell, Camp Scott changed character. In the daytime, the woods felt inviting, almost friendly. In the evening, the trees held more shadow, and the paths between cabins felt longer. The air cooled slightly, and the quiet became deeper. The camp did not become frightening, but it became more unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity can make even safe places feel strange. Cabin life at night was its own world. Inside, the girls would have changed into sleepwear, settled into bunks, and talked in small clusters. Some would have been laughing softly, still caught in the excitement of being away from home. Others would have been quieter, listening to the sounds outside and realizing that the night in the woods carried noises they were not used to hearing from inside a bedroom. Counselors were nearby, often moving between cabins to make sure everyone was settled. They encouraged calm, reminded the girls of rules, and answered the small questions that always appear at bedtime. Where is the bathroom? What happens if I need something? What if I cannot sleep? These questions were not panic. They were simply part of adjusting, and they were met with reassurance. At a summer camp, the sense of safety is built through repetition. The same steps happen every night. The same voices guide the same process. Lights out comes at the same time. Quiet hours begin. That rhythm tells children that nothing unexpected is supposed to happen, and that if something does happen, adults will respond. Inside the cabins, flashlights became tiny stars. Girls used them to whisper across bunks, to look for items in bags, to create shadow shapes on walls. Someone might tell a small story, the kind that is meant to make friends laugh rather than feel afraid. These moments are part of camp culture, an early bonding ritual that makes the first night feel memorable. But the woods outside remained dark. The camp did not have the kind of lighting that turns nighttime into a softened version of day. Once cabin lights went out, the boundaries of the world shifted. The forest became a wide, silent space with movement that could not always be seen. Insects hummed, leaves shifted. The air carried sounds from far away and made them feel close. Most children in a cabin setting interpret these sounds in the same way. They become background. After a while, the nervous system adjusts. The mind stops trying to identify every noise. Exhaustion takes over, and sleep arrives in waves. In Cabin 8, where Laurie Farmer, Doris Milner, and Michelle Guess were staying, the atmosphere would have been much the same. The cabin held the quiet busyness of settling in, girls adjusting blankets, feet climbing into bunks, whispered goodnight messages, the feeling that the next day would bring more activities, more laughter, more ordinary moments that would become camp memories. The concept of danger would have felt distant. Children were surrounded by other children. They were at a Girl Scout camp. Adults were present. Rules existed. The woods felt like part of the adventure, not part of a threat. This is the kind of trust that makes camp possible. It is what allows children to sleep away from home without constant fear. The camp staff, meanwhile, continued their own routines. Counselors finished checks. Some gathered to talk quietly after the cabins settled. Others moved through the camp doing final tasks, making sure the night was stable and calm. Night duties at camp are often repetitive and uneventful. They involve listening for noise, ensuring children are asleep, and responding to small needs. It is in this quiet normality that the tragedy becomes hardest to imagine. Nothing about the camp's routines suggested vulnerability. The cabins were grouped, the girls were together, the staff were present. The camp felt like a contained world. And yet, the very qualities that made it feel open and natural also meant it was not sealed from the outside. It was protected by trust and distance, not by locked boundaries. The woods do not always announce movement clearly. A person can step between shadows without being visible from a cabin window. Footsteps can be softened by grass and earth. Sounds can be swallowed by insects and wind. At night, the forest becomes a place where the edges of perception blur. For most campers, this is harmless. For a person intent on harm, it can become cover. The night before the murders was, in every outward way, an ordinary camp night. Girls were falling asleep. Counselors were finishing their checks. The camp was quieting down. The trees held the same shadows they held every night, and the stars overhead looked the same as they always did. There were no alarms, no warnings, no sudden sounds that caused the entire camp to wake. This absence became one of the most unsettling aspects of the case later. Not only what happened, but how quietly it happened. How easily the night passed without the camp realizing that something irreversible was unfolding within it. The cabin would have been filled with the soft sounds of sleep, breath, small movements, whispered words fading into silence, the air becoming still as the girls drifted off one by one. And then, somewhere in that darkness, something moved. Not loudly, not hurriedly, but with a kind of intention that did not belong in a place like this. It is difficult to hold the night before as anything other than calm, because it was calm. It was designed to be calm. Every part of camp life was structured to create peace by night, so children could rest and wake up ready for the next day. That is what makes the story endure. The tragedy did not arrive in chaos. It arrived in quiet. Camp Scott went to sleep, as it always did, trusting the darkness the way children trust it when they believe adults have built safety correctly. The girls in Cabin 8 closed their eyes with the assumption that morning would come. The camp itself rested in the deep woods, surrounded by trees that felt protective rather than threatening. And through all of that stillness, the night carried on, until it did not. Morning at camp, Scott arrived the way camp mornings always arrive, slowly at first, then suddenly full of movement. The light filtered through the trees, turning the forest from shadow into something familiar again. Birds and insects replaced the night's silence with soft sound. In most summers, the first morning of camp is filled with routine. Counselors wake the girls. Everyone gets dressed. Shoes are found, hair is brushed, and the camp begins its next day. That morning began with those same expectations. Counselors moved through cabin areas, preparing for the day's schedule. The camp was built around repetition, and on the second day, the rhythm usually feels even more stable. The first night is always the most unfamiliar, but once morning comes, children settle into the comfort of routine. In a place like Camp Scott, the morning was meant to bring relief, breakfast, activity, and normality. But something felt wrong early on. There was a quiet delay, a subtle disruption in what should have been the simplest part of the day. Cabin 8, the cabin where Laurie Farmer, Doris Milner, Michelle Goodwess, and other girls were staying, did not respond the way it should have. In a camp cabin, mornings are usually loud. Children wake at different times. Someone giggles, someone complains, someone moves too quickly and knocks something over. Even the quietest cabin produces a certain level of life. That morning, there was stillness. Counselors approached the cabin with the assumption that perhaps the girls were sleeping in, exhausted from the first day. It would not have seemed alarming at first. Children often sleep deeply after a long day outdoors. The counselors were likely expecting to open the door, call out a wake-up greeting, and watch the cabin come alive. But when they entered, they were met by something that did not belong in a place like this. The details of the initial discovery, as it has been discussed over time, are difficult to hold in the mind because they mark the exact moment the camp shifted from safety to emergency. In many true crime stories, there is a dramatic turning point, a moment where everything changes. At Camp Scott, the turning point came through an ordinary routine, the simple act of going to wake children up. When the counselors realized something was terribly wrong, the response of the camp began to change rapidly. In a structured environment like this, adults move quickly once danger is confirmed. There is a shift from routine to command, from gentle instruction to emergency response. The calm voices become firm, the movements become coordinated. Other staff were alerted. The camp's leadership was contacted, and the internal procedures for crisis began to unfold. Counselors and staff members would have tried to protect the other campers from seeing what had been discovered. Because even in panic, there is an instinct to preserve childhood from direct exposure to horror. Children were redirected. Activities were paused. Girls were kept together, away from the cabin area. The camp itself, which had been alive with morning routines, began to feel unsettled. There is a particular kind of atmosphere that arrives when a group senses something serious is happening, but does not fully understand what it is. Children recognize tension in adult voices. They notice rushed movements. They sensed the absence of normal instruction. The camp would have filled with confusion, whispers, and the quiet fear that comes from not knowing. Emergency calls were made. Local authorities were contacted, and the transition from camp staff to law enforcement began. This moment is important, because it is where the story moves from private tragedy into public reality. Once police arrive, the camp is no longer only a summer camp. It becomes a crime scene, and the woods that held laughter the day before become part of an investigation. The area around Cabin 8 became the center of attention. Staff tried to secure it. Police began to assess what they were dealing with. But in a rural setting like this, with a camp full of children, control was difficult. There were many moving parts, many people frightened and confused, and the instinct to help often clashes with the need to preserve evidence. The discovery did not remain contained for long. Word spread quickly, first through staff, then through law enforcement, and then outward into the community. Parents would soon begin receiving calls, and for many, those calls would become the worst moment of their lives. The uncertainty of not knowing which child was affected, or what had occurred, would have been overwhelming. Within the camp, the emotional shift was immediate. The woods felt different. The same trees, the same paths, the same cabins. But once fear enters a place, it changes the way silence sounds. It changes the way shadows look. It changes the way distance feels. The camp did not physically transform, but the meaning of it did, and that meaning could not be undone. Counselors would have struggled to maintain order among the campers. Children cried. Some demanded to go home. Others stayed quiet, watching everything with wide eyes. The staff had to balance two impossible responsibilities at once: to comfort children while also cooperating with law enforcement, to continue functioning while their own sense of safety was collapsing. The camp's systems were not built for something like this. They were built for scraped knees, homesickness, and lost items. They were not built for a crime. They were not built for the kind of fear that arrives when innocence is broken, not by accident, but by deliberate harm. As the morning progressed, law enforcement began to expand beyond the cabin. They examined paths, surrounding woods, and the broader camp area. The question was immediate and urgent. How could this happen here? How could someone get close enough? How could the camp sleep through it? The search for explanation began before the investigation had even fully formed. The other campers were gradually removed from the area. Parents were contacted. Arrangements were made. The camp's session effectively collapsed into emergency closure. What had been planned as a week of camp life ended abruptly, not with packed souvenirs and happy goodbyes, but with confusion, grief, and shock. For the people who were there, the morning discovery became a dividing line in memory. There is before that moment, when the camp felt safe and ordinary, and there is after it, when every sound in the woods carried a different meaning. Even years later, survivors and those connected to the camp would remember the way the morning felt, not just what happened, but how quickly the day changed shape, how the air seemed heavier, how the sunlight did not bring comfort the way it usually does, how the presence of adults did not feel reassuring anymore, because even adults had not been able to prevent the night. This is the moment the story becomes irreversible, because once the morning discovery happened, nothing could return to normal. Not at Camp Scott, and not for the families waiting at home. The camp's purpose as a place of safety had been shattered, and the only thing left was the slow, painful process of trying to understand what had occurred. The investigation would soon begin in full. Evidence would be examined. Theories would rise. Names would be questioned. Trials would follow. But all of that came after this single moment. The moment when an ordinary morning routine revealed that the night had carried something the camp had not seen coming. And from that moment onward, Camp Scott was no longer simply a summer camp. It was a place marked by tragedy, and by questions that would last for years. The early investigation began with urgency. but not with clarity. Camp Scott was suddenly transformed from a place built for routine into a place that needed answers immediately. Law enforcement arrived to a setting unlike the usual crime scene. This was not a private home or an isolated alleyway. It was a summer camp filled with cabins, trees, and trails, and it had only recently been full of children waking up to start the day. Police and investigators had to balance two opposing realities at once. The first was the need to secure the scene and preserve evidence. The second was the fact that the camp had been active, full of movement, and filled with frightened staff and campers when the discovery occurred. The environment was complicated. It was wide. It was wooded. It was not designed for containment. The first steps were focused on immediate control. The area around the cabin was treated as the center of the case, a point from which every other action would expand. Investigators examined entry points, pathways, and the immediate surroundings. They looked at the ground and the nearby terrain with the awareness that in a forested environment, evidence can be fragile. Footprints can be softened by soil. Leaves can be shifted by wind. Anything left behind can be altered quickly by weather or wildlife. The camp itself had to be cleared, and this process was its own kind of chaos. Staff were trying to protect children from seeing too much. Counselors were trying to keep groups together. Police were trying to separate people for questioning while also keeping them away from the central area. The movement of people that morning was not malicious, but it was unavoidable, and every movement carried the potential to disturb what investigators needed most. Once the camp was emptied and the immediate shock settled into a controlled response, attention shifted toward documentation. Investigators began collecting statements from staff, counselors, and anyone who had been present during the night. These interviews were essential because the camp's routines were the closest thing investigators had to a timeline. They needed to know when lights went out, when cabin checks were completed, whether anything unusual had been noticed, and whether any sound had been heard during the night. This was where the investigation faced one of its first difficulties. Night at a camp is full of small noises that people learn to ignore. Wind through trees, insects, branches shifting, distant movement from wildlife. Even the sound of footsteps can be difficult to identify with certainty in a place where cabins are separated by darkness and the ground absorbs sound. What seemed unusual in hindsight may not have seemed unusual in the moment. Investigators also had to consider the emotional state of those they were interviewing. Counselors and staff were in shock. Some were grieving, some were frightened. Memory under stress does not always behave reliably. People recall fragments. They mix sequences. They become unsure about what they truly noticed and what they only realized afterward. Early statements can change over time, not because people are lying, but because trauma alters perception. As questioning continued, law enforcement began to widen its focus beyond the cabin area. Camp Scott sat in a region that was not completely isolated, but it was removed enough to create a buffer of quiet. Investigators considered whether someone could have entered from outside without being noticed. They looked at the boundaries of the camp, at the trails leading into the woods, and at any areas where a person could move through without crossing well-lit or frequently monitored space. This widened search brought a new problem. The camp was large, and the environment was natural. Unlike an urban crime scene with clear entrances and exits, the woods offer countless paths. Movement is not restricted by walls. A person can approach from different angles, leave no obvious mark, and vanish into distance quickly. Even if footprints existed, the ground might not preserve them clearly. Evidence collection began, but it carried limitations. In 1977, forensic science existed, but it was not as advanced or as rapid as it is now. Investigators documented what they could, preserved what they could, and sent materials for testing where possible. But the process was slower, and the expectation of instant answers did not match reality. The case became public very quickly. News spread beyond the town and into wider attention. As coverage expanded, public pressure began to form around the investigation. People wanted immediate answers. They wanted to believe that a crime like this could be solved quickly if enough force was applied. But investigations do not move faster simply because the public demands speed. If anything, pressure often complicates them because it introduces noise. Tips began to flood in. Some were useful, many were not. People reported suspicious vehicles seen near roads. Others recalled strangers in the area days earlier. Rumors spread through communities, and those rumors sometimes made their way into law enforcement channels, forcing investigators to spend time chasing leads that were built more on fear than on evidence. Investigators began constructing an early picture of what might have happened, based not on certainty, but on what seemed possible. They considered timing. They considered how a person could move through the camp at night. They considered whether the crime could have been committed by someone familiar with the camp layout, someone who knew where cabins were located and how to approach them quietly. This question of familiarity became central early on. Camp Scott was not a random location on a map. It was a property with routines and structure. Someone unfamiliar might still enter, but someone familiar would have an easier time navigating the darkness without being seen. This possibility pushed investigators to look not only outward, at strangers, but inward, at anyone connected to the camp or the surrounding area. The early investigation also had to grapple with the painful reality that the victims were children, and that fact changes how a community responds. Crimes involving children produce a special intensity. Parents become fearful in a way that is difficult to contain. Communities shift into suspicion. Every unknown face becomes a potential threat. The desire for certainty becomes urgent, almost desperate. As the days passed, law enforcement worked to maintain control over the investigation. They attempted to separate fact from rumor. They continued interviews. They reviewed schedules and staff lists. They looked at previous incidents, if any existed. They considered whether there had been warnings or threats before the camp session began. The search for a suspect began quietly, but it was shaped from the start by complexity. The crime had taken place at night, in darkness, in a wooded environment, in a location designed for openness rather than security. The absence of witnesses and the difficulty of evidence preservation meant that the investigation would rely heavily on reconstruction rather than direct observation. This was the beginning of a long case. The early investigation was not defined by a single breakthrough. It was defined by careful accumulation. Statement after statement, search after search, evidence gathered and stored, the building of a file that grew heavier with each passing day, not because it held answers, but because it held questions. Camp Scott had become a place of investigation, and the woods that had once been filled with children's voices became silent under scrutiny. Trails were examined, cabins were measured. The ground was searched for signs that might have been missed the first time. Yet even in those early days, a painful understanding began to form. That solving the case would not be quick. That the environment had made it difficult to see what happened. That fear alone could not produce clarity. And that even with determination, the truth might remain just out of reach. The investigation would continue, and it would evolve, taking turns through suspects, trials, and long years of debate. But this early stage set the tone. A crime that began in silence had now created a search for answers that would last far beyond the summer of 1977. The evidence and scene details at Camp Scott became the foundation of everything that followed, not because they offered easy answers, but because they were among the few concrete pieces investigators could hold on to, in a case that quickly filled with uncertainty. A camp is not like a private home where movement can be traced through locked doors and controlled entry points. It is a living, outdoor environment made up of wide spaces, woods, and multiple pathways. that made the physical scene both important and difficult. From the beginning, investigators focused on the area closest to the cabin where the girls had been sleeping. Cabin 8 sat within a group of cabins meant for campers of a similar age, and, like many camp structures, it was simple in design. It was not built to resist intrusion, only to shelter children from weather and offer a place to sleep. That simplicity was part of its purpose, but it also meant there were fewer barriers between the cabin and the outside world. The cabin area itself became a central point of examination. Investigators documented its condition carefully. They examined entry points, including doors and windows, noting anything that appeared disturbed or unusual. They observed the way bedding and personal items were arranged, not in a sensational way, but in an attempt to reconstruct how the night may have unfolded. In cases like this, small details can carry disproportionate weight, because they are among the few traces that remain when no one witnessed the crime directly. Outside the cabin, the woods became part of the scene. Camp Scott was surrounded by natural terrain, and the ground carried evidence differently depending on weather, foot traffic, and vegetation. Investigators searched for signs of movement through dirt, grass, and soft earth. They looked for disturbances that did not match normal camp activity. This was complicated by the fact that the camp had been active just hours earlier, filled with children and staff moving through the area in ordinary ways. One of the earliest investigative challenges was contamination. When something horrifying is discovered in a communal setting, people move instinctively. Staff rush to get help. Counselors check on children. Adults enter and leave spaces that later need to be controlled. Even with the best intentions, this kind of movement can compromise what investigators later need to analyze. In 1977, crime scene preservation existed as a concept, but it did not always function smoothly in large outdoor environments, especially when children were involved. Investigators documented what items were present and what items were not. Personal belongings, clothing, and ordinary camp objects were evaluated for relevance. In a cabin setting, there are many objects that belong to many people, and sorting which details matter requires careful attention. What belongs to the routine of camp, and what feels out of place? What was left exactly where it should have been, and what appeared altered? The camp's staff were also interviewed about anything unusual they had noticed leading up to the session. Investigators considered the possibility that there may have been warning signs before the camp officially began. Not necessarily direct threats, but smaller indicators that something was wrong. This included reports of disturbances near the cabin area in the period before the girls arrived. In many investigations, early warnings are not fully understood until after the fact, and what seemed minor at the time can later take on significance. The location where evidence was found mattered as much as the evidence itself. Investigators examined the surrounding environment for places where a person could move unseen. Tree lines, slopes, and pathways were assessed as potential routes of approach and exit. In a rural camp setting, there are countless ways to move through darkness without being noticed, especially if someone is patient and familiar with outdoor terrain. The location where evidence was found mattered as much as the evidence itself. Investigators examined the surrounding environment for places where a person could move unseen. Tree lines, slopes, and pathways were assessed as potential routes of approach and exit. In a rural camp setting, there are countless ways to move through darkness without being noticed, especially if someone is patient and familiar with outdoor terrain. The timeline was also treated as a form of evidence. Investigators established the window between when the campers were last known to be safe and when the tragedy was discovered. They worked backward from morning routines, counselor checks, and staff recollections. In many cases, the timeline in the first 24 hours can shift as more statements come in, but investigators still need an initial framework to guide their search. As evidence collection continued, law enforcement sought assistance from specialized resources. Cases involving children and high public attention often draw broader investigative involvement, and this case was no different. The presence of multiple agencies and specialists can bring expertise, but it can also create complexity, as large investigations require coordination and consistent documentation. The physical evidence was carefully preserved where possible, but investigators knew from the beginning that it might not provide easy answers. Forensic testing at the time was limited compared to modern standards. Certain types of analysis that are routine today were not widely available or reliable then. This meant the investigation relied heavily on what could be observed, documented, and cross-referenced through interviews and comparison. Investigators also explored the possibility of a suspect leaving behind items or traces that did not belong at the camp. In cases like this, out-of-place objects can become central to theories. However, outdoor environments present a problem. Items can be carried by wind, left by unrelated visitors, or moved unintentionally. Determining relevance requires careful context, and context was difficult because the camp had been used for years by many groups. The evidence also created uncomfortable questions about security and supervision. Camp Scott was a place built on trust, but the investigation had to examine whether there were vulnerabilities that had been overlooked. This included the distance between cabins, the effectiveness of night checks, and the ability of staff to monitor such a wide property after dark. These questions were not meant to assign blame to counselors, many of whom were young and traumatized themselves. They were meant to understand what conditions could have allowed the crime to occur without detection. As days passed, the evidence and scene details were absorbed into a larger narrative that the investigation would carry for years. Every detail became part of debate. Every statement became part of speculation. The case was not only about what happened, but about what could be proven and what could not. The scene at Camp Scott did not offer a clear answer. It offered fragments. It offered impressions. It offered details that could be interpreted in multiple ways. The woods in the cabin did not speak plainly. They held evidence quietly, and what they revealed depended on the limits of the era's tools and the clarity of human memory under shock. And in the years that followed, those early scene details would remain at the center of the case. Revisited again and again as investigators and the public searched for certainty in a story defined from the beginning by the most painful kind of silence. In the months and years after the murders at Camp Scott, the investigation moved into a phase that many long cases eventually enter, a phase where the center of gravity keeps changing. New information would surface, attention would narrow, then it would widen again. Names would rise into focus, then fade. Leads would feel promising for a moment, then dissolve into uncertainty. This constant shifting did not mean investigators were careless. It meant the case did not offer a straight path. In a crime with no clear eyewitnesses and limited physical evidence, suspicion forms in a particular way. It begins with proximity. Who was nearby, who had access, who knew the area, who could have moved through the camp without drawing attention. From there, investigators move outward into possibility. People who lived in the region, individuals with histories that suggested risk, anyone who stood out, not necessarily because of proof, but because of fear. One of the earliest focus shifts involved the question of familiarity. Camp Scott was not a location you would easily navigate in complete darkness unless you knew it. It had cabins spaced across wooded terrain, paths that only made sense when you understood where they led, and an atmosphere where silence could hide movement. Investigators considered whether the offender might have had experience with the camp or with similar places, giving the confidence to move without hesitation. This line of thinking pushed attention toward people connected to the camp itself. Current staff, former staff, contractors, local individuals who might have worked nearby, anyone who had reason to know the layout of the property or feel comfortable moving through it at night. Even when no evidence pointed directly toward these individuals, investigators still had to examine the possibility, because the case demanded that every avenue be tested. Another shift came through reports and rumors of suspicious behavior in the area. Communities around summer camps often notice unfamiliar vehicles or outsiders passing through, even if those sightings are not unusual in rural settings. After the crime, ordinary details became charged with meaning. A person seen near the camp weeks earlier, a stranger walking along the road, a vehicle parked in a place it did not belong. These were the types of details that investigators collected, knowing that most would lead nowhere, but unable to ignore them. The investigation eventually centered strongly on a man named Jean Leroy Hart. Hart was a local man with a criminal history, and he was familiar with the region. He had escaped from prison not long before the murders, and he had experienced moving through the rural landscape. This combination of factors, familiarity and mobility, made him a compelling focus for investigators. In a case built on uncertainty, a suspect who fit multiple practical requirements often becomes a gravitational center. Hart's name became significant, not only because of his background, but because of the way the investigation began to link him to the area and the circumstances. He became a figure who could explain the darkest questions: how someone could enter a camp unseen, how someone could move through wooded terrain confidently, and how someone could vanish afterward. As investigators focused on Hart, the case began to narrow. Search efforts expanded. Law enforcement intensified pursuit. The public became aware that authorities were looking at a specific person. In many investigations, once a suspect becomes dominant, other possibilities begin to receive less attention, not always intentionally, but naturally. Resources are finite. Time is limited. Focus becomes strategy. But even as Hart became a main suspect, the case did not settle. A dominant suspect can create the illusion of resolution. But if evidence does not fully confirm responsibility, doubt remains. Investigators had to consider how much of the suspicion was grounded in provable connection, and how much was shaped by the need to find someone who could fit the story. This is the tension that defines focus shifts in long investigations. When a case becomes public and emotionally charged, the demand for answers can unintentionally shape the direction of inquiry. Investigators face pressure from families, communities, and the media. They must pursue leads quickly, but they must also avoid forcing the case into a conclusion that cannot be supported. Over time, the case against Hart moved forward in a way that many people interpreted as the beginning of closure. He was captured and brought into legal process. A trial followed. The investigation became more formal and more visible, shifting from a search in the woods to a process in the courtroom. Yet even this stage contained uncertainty. The public response to Hart as a suspect was intense, and that intensity carried complexity. Some people believed the case had been solved. Others questioned whether the focus on Hart might have overshadowed other possibilities. In a high-profile case, community beliefs often divide, not because people disagree about the tragedy, but because they disagree about certainty. This is why the focus shifts continued even after a primary suspect emerged. Alternative theories did not disappear. Some wondered whether another person could have been involved. Others questioned whether certain evidence suggested a different story. When a case involves a setting like a summer camp, people often struggle to believe that one person could move through it without being detected, and that struggle creates room for speculation. The investigation also faced the reality that not all questions could be answered even with a suspect. How did the offender enter the camp? How did the offender approach the cabin without alerting anyone? How did the offender leave without being seen? These questions remained even as the case narrowed, because the environment itself, the woods, the dark, the silence, remained difficult to fully map into certainty. A person can disappear into a forest in a way that seems impossible to those who have never tried. But the human mind still resists accepting that something can happen without being noticed. Over time, the case became shaped not only by the suspect, but by the broader social tensions that followed. Communities often respond to tragedy by searching for meaning. People want to believe that harm is avoidable if they can identify the right threat. This leads to a form of psychological comfort. If the offender is a certain kind of person, then safety can be restored by avoiding that kind of person. If the crime can be contained within one explanation, the world can feel predictable again. But the case did not offer predictability. Even with focus narrowing, even with a suspect tried, the story did not settle comfortably into certainty. Questions lingered, debates continued, doubt remained. This is why, years later, the murders at Camp Scott are still spoken of with unease. Not only because of what happened, but because the investigation moved through so many phases. It shifted focus again and again, reflecting the struggle to hold on to something solid in a case filled with uncertainty. Suspects and focus shifts are often remembered as the heart of unresolved investigations. They represent the search itself, the effort to take a tragedy and pull meaning from it. In this case, each shift carried hope, then disappointment. Each new suspect brought the possibility of closure, then the return of silence. And by the time the investigation entered its trial phase, the focus had narrowed sharply, but the unanswered questions had not disappeared. They simply waited in the background, ready to return the moment certainty was questioned again. The case eventually moved into the courtroom, and with that shift, the atmosphere around it changed again. Investigations often feel like searching through fog, chasing fragments and possibilities. A trial is different. A trial is structured. It forces a story into a sequence. It takes evidence, testimony, and interpretation and asks a jury to place everything into one conclusion. For many people watching from the outside, the trial represented the moment when the case would finally become understandable. It offered the hope that the chaos and uncertainty of the early months could be gathered into something clear. In cases involving the deaths of children, that hope carries extra weight. Communities do not just want answers. They need them, because without them, fear remains loose and uncontained. The defendant at the center of the trial was Jean Leroy Hart, a man whose name had already become deeply tied to the case in public conversation. Hart's history and the circumstances that brought law enforcement's focus onto him shaped much of the way the public perceived the proceedings. Many people had already decided what they believed long before the first testimony began. That is one of the quiet realities of high-profile cases. Courtrooms may be designed for neutrality, but public emotion rarely enters neutral. Inside the courtroom, the legal process moved forward through argument and evidence rather than instinct and rumor. Witnesses testified. Investigators described their work. The prosecution presented its case, attempting to show that Hart was responsible beyond reasonable doubt. The defense challenged the strength of the evidence, the reliability of witness statements, and the gaps that still remained within the investigation. In a case like this, the trial becomes a battle over certainty. It is not only about what might have happened, but about what can be proven. A jury is not asked to decide what feels most likely. A jury is asked to decide what is established strongly enough to justify conviction. That difference is sometimes difficult for the public to accept, especially when the crime itself feels so unbearable that people want the legal outcome to match the emotional outcome. The evidence presented was the kind often seen in cases where direct eyewitness testimony is absent. It depended on forensic analysis available at the time, contextual details, and broader inferences about access and opportunity. The prosecution sought to connect Hart to the location and circumstances in a way that created a coherent narrative. The defense sought to highlight uncertainty and show that possibility is not the same as proof. Throughout the trial, the emotional atmosphere remained heavy. The case carried the weight of grief, anger, and fear. It was not simply a legal proceeding. It was a community's attempt to place an ending on a story that had shattered trust. Every detail mattered, not only to lawyers and investigators, but to families and observers who needed to believe that the system could still deliver justice. When the verdict arrived, it did not bring universal relief. Hart was acquitted. The jury did not find the case proven beyond reasonable doubt, and legally, that meant he could not be held responsible in a criminal conviction. For some, this verdict felt like the case had collapsed back into uncertainty. For others, it felt like a necessary outcome when evidence did not meet the burden required. The public reaction was intense and divided. That division is common in cases where the emotional need for closure is stronger than the legal certainty available. Many people believed Hart was guilty and saw the acquittal as a failure of justice. Others believed the evidence had not been strong enough and viewed the verdict as the system functioning as intended, refusing to convict without proof that removed doubt. The aftermath of the trial did not calm the community. In many ways, it deepened the unease. The trial had forced the case into public focus again, reopening grief and fear. When the verdict did not produce closure, those emotions had nowhere to settle. The case remained unresolved in the minds of many, even if a legal proceeding had concluded. Another layer of complexity emerged soon after, when Hart died not long after the trial. His death removed the possibility of future prosecution, and it also removed the one person most closely associated with the crime in the public imagination. This did not resolve the case. It intensified questions. For some, it cemented guilt in their minds, as if the story had ended without accountability. For others, it reinforced the sense that the truth would never be fully known. The public conversation shifted again, back toward theory and speculation. If Hart was not convicted, then what did that mean? Did it mean the wrong suspect had been pursued? Did it mean the system could not prove what it believed? Or did it mean the case had never truly been solvable in the first place? Because the environment, the timing, and the lack of witnesses had created an unsolvable gap. In the years that followed, the trial became a defining feature of the case's legacy. Not because it resolved anything, but because it formalized the uncertainty. The courtroom had presented the facts as they could be argued, and the outcome had confirmed that certainty was out of reach. The trial offered structure, but it could not produce closure. For the families, the verdict did not undo grief. It did not restore what had been lost. It did not provide the calm that people imagine justice will bring. Instead, it left them with the heavy reality that sometimes the system cannot deliver the kind of ending a tragedy demands. The legal process can only work with what it has. It cannot create evidence where none exists. For the wider public, the case became something that lingered. It settled into the category of stories people tell in quiet voices, stories that change how people see familiar places. It became the kind of case that parents remember when deciding whether to send children away for camp, the kind of story that influences safety policies and cultural fear even decades later. The trial, the verdict, and the public reaction did not end the story. They changed the tone of it. The case shifted from active search to enduring doubt, from the urgency of investigation to the slow weight of unanswered questions. And it is that weight that remains today, not only the tragedy itself, but the feeling that even after a trial, even after years of effort, the truth can still remain just beyond reach, leaving behind a silence that no courtroom can fully break. Years passed, and yet the story did not settle into the past the way most stories eventually do. The Oklahoma Girl Scout murders remained present in memory, not only because of what happened, but because of what remained unresolved. In many cases, time softens the sharpness of public attention. But in cases like this, time does something different. It deepens the questions. It makes the unanswered parts feel heavier, because they have lasted so long without being filled. Reinvestigation often begins quietly. not with an announcement, but with the simple fact that a case still sits unfinished, waiting for someone to look at it again. New detectives arrive, new leadership takes interest, new technology becomes available. Old evidence is revisited. Files are opened, studied, and compared against modern standards. What was once considered inconclusive is examined again with a different lens. In this case, the years that followed brought new attempts to understand what had happened at Camp Scott, even after the trial had ended. The legal process had provided an outcome, but it had not produced universal certainty. The case remained a subject of debate and continued to exist within the broader category of crimes that never fully resolve in the public mind. One reason reinvestigation remained possible was that the case had always been heavily documented. High-profile crimes generate large amounts of material. Statements, maps, interviews, records of evidence collection, and investigative notes accumulate over time. Even when a case grows cold, those documents remain. They become the foundation for anyone who returns to the story later, trying to see what others may have missed. As time passed, the broader landscape of criminal investigation changed dramatically. Forensics advanced, evidence processing improved, databases expanded, agencies became more connected. The idea that old cases could be renewed through modern science became increasingly common. This created hope that even a case rooted in the limitations of the 1970s might be pushed closer to clarity. But reinvestigation is not only about technology, it is also about perspective. New investigators bring different instincts. They interpret witness statements differently. They notice small contradictions or patterns that earlier teams might not have prioritized. They ask new questions. They return to the timeline and examine it with less emotional urgency and more analytical distance. Sometimes that distance helps. Sometimes it simply reveals how difficult the case has always been. A major ongoing question in the case remains centered around certainty. Some people believed the identity of the offender was obvious. Others believed the trial's outcome reflected real doubt. This divide did not disappear with time. It hardened into two separate realities, each supported by its own interpretation of the available information. The reinvestigation also kept returning to the setting itself. Camp Scott became more than a location. It became a symbol of contrast, a place designed for safety and childhood, a place where something terrible occurred in the dark. Investigators and researchers continued to examine how the environment could have shaped the event, how movement could occur unnoticed, how sound could be masked, how a person could approach and leave without triggering the alarm of an entire camp. This environmental question was not simple. It required understanding how people behave at night, how camps function, and how perception works in darkness. Counselors perform checks, but they do not expect danger. They expect homesickness, wandering children, and small rule-breaking. Their attention is shaped by what they believe is possible. This is not a failure of character. It is a reflection of how human awareness functions. Years later, questions also remained about early investigative decisions. Cold cases often revisit these moments, not to blame individuals, but to understand where momentum was gained or lost. In the initial urgency of a high-profile crime, investigators must act quickly, and quick decisions can shape everything that follows. Later reviews often ask whether certain leads were pursued too strongly, whether others were overlooked, and whether the pressure of public fear influenced the direction of the search. Another question that persisted involved the nature of the evidence itself. Some pieces of evidence in a case can be interpreted in different ways depending on the narrative frame. One interpretation suggests a single offender. Another suggests possible involvement of more than one person. Another suggests that circumstances may have been misread early on. Without definitive proof, the evidence becomes a space where competing explanations can coexist. Reinvestigation also brings renewed attention from the public. True crime communities, writers, and documentary efforts often revive cold cases, keeping them in conversation long after official investigation slows. This attention can be double-edged. It can generate useful tips and encourage official review, but it can also create new rumor and speculation that clouds the record. The families, meanwhile, live with a different version of time. For those directly affected, the case does not become distant history. It remains part of life, carried through years and decades. Reinvestigation can bring hope, but it can also reopen grief. Every renewed question reminds them that nothing has ever been settled completely. In many cold cases, the most difficult reality is that questions can survive even when answers seem close. A person can be suspected strongly without being proven legally. A case can be argued convincingly without being closed definitively. This is the space where the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders have remained for years, caught between the human need for certainty and the legal requirement for proof. The longer time passes, the more the case becomes layered. It becomes not only a story of what happened, but a story of how people reacted afterward, how the camp changed, how communities changed, how parents across the country began to view summer camps through a different lens, how safety culture shifted, how the quiet trust of childhood places became harder to maintain. In later years, the questions did not disappear. They continued to exist like a low, persistent hum. Could it have been prevented? Were warning signs missed? Was the investigation forced into a direction too soon? Did the legal system reach the right conclusion? Could modern science ever provide certainty? These questions remain because the case holds a unique kind of emotional contradiction. It is not only a crime, but a disruption of a place that represented safety. The story refuses to settle because it is difficult to accept that something so severe could occur in such a setting, without leaving behind a clear ending. And so the reinvestigation continues in the way many cold cases continue, through occasional reviews, through renewed public interest, through the hope that something overlooked may surface again, through the possibility that the silence might one day break, not with rumor or theory, but with clarity. Until then, the case remains suspended, not forgotten, not resolved, but quietly present, holding its questions in the background, waiting for an answer that time has so far refused to give. The quiet legacy of Camp Scott is not found in one clear lesson or one simple change. It is found in the way the story stayed behind long after the camp itself faded from ordinary use. Some places carry memory lightly, becoming stories people tell and then leave behind. Camp Scott became something different. It became a place where memory settled into the landscape, where the woods and cabins held a kind of silence that could not be undone. For those who lived near the area, the camp was never just a camp again. It became a reference point, a name that carried weight. People spoke of it carefully, as if speaking too freely might invite something back into the present. The tragedy altered how the place was perceived, and once perception changes, a place can never return to its original meaning. Even if the trees stand the same, the human mind does not. In the years that followed, the story influenced how families thought about childhood and safety. Before this case, summer camp was a symbol of independence in its gentlest form. It was a way for children to step away from home while still being protected by routine and adult supervision. Camp Scott became a reminder that safety is not guaranteed by intention alone. It showed that places designed for innocence can still be reached by harm. And that realization changed the way parents imagined the world. The Girl Scouts, and youth organizations more broadly, also carried the weight of that change. After a tragedy like this, policies shift even when the details remain debated. Camps across the country became more aware of security, boundaries, supervision practices, and the realities of nighttime vulnerability. Many camps tightened procedures, improved lighting, increased staff training, and revised how cabin areas were monitored. These changes did not erase what happened, but they reflected the way the tragedy reshaped responsibility. The legacy was also carried through the way the case remained unresolved in the public mind. Even when years pass, unresolved cases do not leave easily. They remain open in conversation because the lack of closure creates a tension that never fully releases. People continue to return to the same questions. Not because the past can be changed, but because the mind resists accepting that something so severe can remain uncertain. Camp Scott became a symbol of that uncertainty. It represented a type of tragedy that does not fit neatly into an ending. There was an investigation, a trial, public reaction, and years of debate. Yet the case remained suspended in a space where certainty could not fully settle. That unresolved quality is part of why the camp's legacy feels so quiet and so heavy. It does not allow the story to conclude. It asks people to live with unfinished truth. For survivors, counselors, and staff who were connected to the camp, the legacy was personal. A camp is meant to be remembered through laughter and friendship. For those who were there, memory became complicated. Ordinary details could become painful. The smell of summer woods, the shape of cabins, the sound of insects at night. These details could return with emotional force long after the event itself. The legacy did not remain contained in history books. It lived inside people. There is also a wider cultural legacy that followed Camp Scott. Stories like this shape collective fear. They become reference points for why safety precautions exist. They become the hidden reasons behind rules that seem excessive to those who do not know the history. They influence how adults respond to children's vulnerability, even when they do not consciously remember the case itself. The most unsettling part of the legacy is how quiet it feels. There was no single ending that allowed the community to breathe again. There was no final certainty that could close the story. Instead, the case remained present through absence. A camp that once hosted ordinary weeks of childhood became remembered through one terrible night, and the shadow of that night stretched across time. Camp Scott itself eventually changed. Over time, camps close, repurpose, or fade from regular use. Places move on, even when memory does not. But the name remained. The story remained. The camp became less a physical space and more a symbol, held in the minds of those who knew what happened there. The quiet legacy is also a reminder of how fragile trust can be. Childhood depends on adults building safe environments and believing in them. When that trust breaks, the effect reaches far beyond one family or one organization. It affects a cultural belief in safe places. It changes how people feel about darkness, distance, and the idea of leaving children in the care of institutions. In the end, Camp Scott's legacy is not loud. It does not announce itself. It lingers. It lives in the way the case is still spoken about decades later. It lives in the way many parents still feel a small, unconscious tightening in their chest when they send children away for the first time. It lives in policies that became stricter, in fears that became sharper, and in the knowledge that safety is something that must be protected deliberately, not assumed. Camp Scott remains, in memory, as a place that should have been ordinary, a place where children should have slept peacefully, a place where the woods should have held only summer sounds. And yet, its name carries a quiet legacy that refuses to fade, because it represents a night that changed how people understood safety, and a silence that never fully lifted afterward. As this story reaches its quiet end, there is no simple way to hold it. The Oklahoma Girl Scout murders are not remembered because of a clean conclusion, or because time neatly resolved what happened. They are remembered because the case left behind an ache that never fully settled, a question that stayed open, and a place that could not return to innocence. Camp Scott was meant to be ordinary. It was meant to be filled with small moments that would fade into happy memory. Girls arriving with bags, counselors calling out instructions, songs carried through trees, shoes left by cabin doors. the soft exhaustion of summer evenings. It was meant to be a week of childhood, simple and safe. And that is what makes the tragedy so difficult to accept. Not only the loss, but the contrast. The way a place designed for protection could still be reached by harm. The way darkness could hold something real and not imagined. The way morning could arrive and reveal that the night had carried far more than anyone understood. Over time, the story became part of history, but it never became distant. The case remained present through memory, through reinvestigation, through public debate, and through the fact that unanswered questions do not fade in the same way solved stories do. A solved story closes the mind's search. An unsolved one continues to echo, returning again and again, asking for certainty that may never arrive. If there is a quiet truth within this story, it is that safety is not always guaranteed by intention. People create safe spaces for children with love and care. They build routines and rules and supervision. They trust that these things form a kind of shield. Most of the time, they do. But sometimes, the world reaches into those spaces anyway, and what follows is not only tragedy, but disbelief. And yet, the story is also about the love that surrounded those children. The families who trusted that camp was a gift. The counselors who tried to create a week of joy. The community that carried grief long after the headlines faded. The people who never stopped wanting answers, not out of curiosity, but out of the need to believe that harm can be contained, that childhood can be protected. The questions remain because the case matters. Not because it should be endlessly revisited, but because it represents something fragile and human. The belief that children deserve safe places. The desire to build environments where they can sleep without fear. The hope that morning will always bring normality back again. As the night continues around you, you do not need to carry the weight of this story any longer. You do not need to solve it. You do not need to reach for closure. Some stories resist it, and forcing an ending does not make them easier to hold. If your thoughts begin to drift, let them drift. Let the details soften. Let the edges blur. Let the quiet return. You are safe where you are. The room is still. The night is steady. And as this story fades into silence, you can allow yourself to rest, knowing that nothing is asked of you now except calm. The camp, the woods, the unanswered questions, they can remain where they belong, in the distance of history. For now, all that remains is quiet. Good night.